First session is going to be led by Dr. Laura Schneider. She is the Associate Professor of Political Science at Grand Valley State University. And she teaches a variety of courses at GVSU, including American Government, Environmental Policy, Women's Health and the Environment, and Women in Public Policy. And she's going to be speaking today about, well, you can see her title, I'm not going to read it for you. She's going to be speaking about that. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the very nice introduction as well. So today I'm going to talk to you about endangered species, and the first bit is going to be just sort of some overview if you aren't familiar about some of the ins and outs of the Endangered Species Act, and then towards the end talking about non-charismatic species. So those are traditionally described as those things that aren't cute and cuddly that you want to go see and hug and love and those sorts of things. So it's really easy to put yourself behind trying to say the species that, like the bald eagle, and well, obviously it's a bird of prey, maybe you aren't into birds of prey, but you know, symbol of the country and all those sorts of things. And so we see these other species, important charismatic species, that get most of the attention and the money from the Endangered Species Act, but most species that need protection don't look like that, or don't have that symbology. So what do we do? How do we try to protect those particular animals and plants, insects, etc.? And so toward the end we'll talk about that. We don't really have a solid answer, but we have some ideas for how we can approach saving those kinds of species moving forward. All right, so there it is, the bald eagle. All right, so the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973. With most of the environmental policies that we have on the books, they were all passed in the 1970s at the height of the environmental movement in the United States. It is designed to protect and recover species as well as ecosystems. However, we really have a species approach in thinking about, speaker's address. It's fine to want to save wolves, but when she's talking about deer and all that other sort of thing, if you're not looking at the ecosystem as a whole and what it needs to be healthy, you're going to have a really hard time saving anything. And so one of the criticisms of the Endangered Species Act is that we don't focus enough on this ecosystem as a whole, and that's problematic in terms of this goal of saving creatures. So most endangered species are actually plants and invertebrates, not cuddly, cute mammals. And so, again, thinking about how we can go about saving these things that's maybe a little bit harder to have an attachment to. As of January 2013, they don't update the numbers all that often. There were 1,436 species listed across the United States as endangered or threatened. Most of these species do not have critical habitat. It used to be required under the law that all species had to have critical habitat associated with them. But we quickly learned that that was very expensive, and so now it's more on a case-by-case basis. There are 286 species on the candidate list. So a candidate list is a group of species that probably should be protected, but for political reasons, commercial reasons, financial reasons, they are not. It's estimated that 9,000 species are at risk. That's about a third of the native species here across the United States are at risk for extinction. There are 37 domestic species that have been removed from the list. 13 have recovered, 9 went extinct, and others were removed because new information was found about them that didn't warrant it, taxonomic reasons. So we're looking at different populations, as well as amendments to the Endangered Species Act. And what I've done throughout the presentation is intersperse different species that are listed either as endangered or threatened on the list. So here we have the bald eagle. And then on this slide we have the eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, which we do have here in Michigan. It is the only rattlesnake that is found in the state of Michigan. And I was told that you can sometimes find them here on the property. So 90% of counties in the United States are home to one or more endangered species. The Department of Environmental Quality here actually has a nice website where you can go and look at all the different species across the counties in the state of Michigan that are endangered. 2/3 exist on private property, which presents significant challenges moving forward for protection. We get into a lot of struggles here with property rights. People don't want the government to tell them what they can and cannot do with their own property. So this presents an additional challenge for trying to protect species across the United States. 210 million, there's only 350 million that live in the United States, live within close proximity to at least one endangered species. So you might not realize it, but more than likely, you live in close proximity to at least one. In the state of Michigan, 25 species are listed on the national list for endangered species. 13 are endangered and 12 are considered to be threatened. So the legislative history of this particular policy, we first started to think about predominantly birds, because bird watching has always been a popular hobby in the United States. In the early 1900s with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. This escalated then a decade later to the Migratory Bird Conservation Act, the Red Book, which was the first list of critical endangered species across the United States in the 1960s, and then a couple earlier iterations to the policy that we have in play now. Our list here, if you look at it online, it has both domestic and international species listed. As the federal government prohibits the trade and sale of endangered species that are not found in our own country. So things like procuring ivory and those sorts of things are illegal. So even though we don't have elephants roaming America, you cannot do that. And so that does not cover, I guess I should make the statement, the current administration just relaxed rules on trophy hunting and bringing trophies from overseas into the United States. That's not the same as this treaty, so just make sure that those are different things. All right, so the listing process. So we have, when we think about listing a species and is endangered or threatened, there's a variety of ways that this could go. They can either be listed as endangered, which means that they are pretty close to going extinct, threatened, which means that they are likely to go extinct, or warranted precluded, which means that, yeah, they're not looking good, but for a variety of reasons, we're going to decide not to actually put them on the list. And this particular rating, if you will, is problematic because once a species is listed but as warranted but precluded, it's very hard for them to actually make it ever onto the list as either threatened or endangered. So we've sort of given them a shout out that we know you're not in good shape, but we don't really care enough to actually do anything about it. What we look at here predominantly when we think about why species are going extinct, habitat destruction, overutilization, so we're overhunting or overfishing or those sorts of things, disease or predation that's affecting a particular species, existing protection that's inadequate could also be a reason to get a species listed, or other natural or man-made factors which are undefined by the government. So anybody can get a species listed as endangered or threatened, or at least start the process for that to occur. So this can be done through petition, either by private individuals, groups, or regulatory bodies. So the Fish and Wildlife Service, if they notice a vulnerable species, can move forward and put a petition forward to have a species go through a study to see if they are warranted to be listed. When we look at protection, we can protect either a whole species, a subspecies, or just a specific population of species. So for example, grizzly bears are protected in the lower 48, they are not protected in Alaska. So we're only protecting a specific population of those grizzly bears. The two regulatory agencies involved are the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the National Marine Fisheries Service, so they deal with all aquatic species across the country. When we thought originally and put this law in place, we didn't care how expensive it was going to be to protect species and to protect biodiversity across America. That quickly changed. With most of our environmental policies actually that we see on the books when they originally passed in the 1970s, we wanted to clean up everything, and we didn't care how expensive it was going to be until we realized how incredibly expensive it was going to be. And then we decided that we were going to take costs into account. So we do cost-benefit analyses to determine if it's worth it to save a particular species. And again, when we think about that cost-benefit analysis, oftentimes what goes into that is the public perception of these animals, right? So it's going to be a lot easier to justify the cost for something like the bald eagle than for the eastern Massasauga rattlesnake. When a species is listed, a recovery plan is required. So we have to think about what it is that we're going to do. But again, we're looking at this as a species-centric plan as opposed to an ecosystem-based plan. So again, if you don't have the proper migration corridors or you don't have the required amount of acreage that you need for mating species or what have you, it's going to be very problematic in terms of actually recovering that species moving forward. The other part of this is that it's very challenging to do because of limited funding. So the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service are grossly underfunded when it comes to the cost of protecting species. And then when we look at the distribution of costs, so who actually gets the money, most of the money goes to the top 10 species on the endangered species list. And then the rest is left to the other, what I said, there was over 1,000 on the list. So most get very little money. There are some species, you can go online to the to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service website, and they will tell you through a nice little spreadsheet who gets actually how much money. So there are some species that get as little as $10 a year to aid their recovery. So that's highly unlikely to happen. All right. Section 9, this is the red cockaded woodpecker, which is one of those species that is on the top 10 list for most funded species in the United States. This is the definition of what you cannot do to an endangered species, and you could be prosecuted for if you harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, collect, or attempt to engage an endangered species. But what might be problematic with this is, again, I said that most species exist on private property, and who's watching you on your private property? So there's this saying of shoot, shovel, and shut up, right? So if you find an endangered species on your property, nobody's going to know, right? If you take action, and especially if you're thinking about development opportunities, which is oftentimes where we see this challenge. It's definitely might be worth it in somebody's opinion to do that so that they can move forward with their projected plan for their property. This no-take applies to both public and private actors. So the government land should also be held to the same standard. However, there are a lot of exceptions to this, which I'll get to in a moment. I'll talk about one of them now. So we've seen this in particular of late with the administration on mining rights and oil and gas exploration, that trumps this no-take policy, no pun intended, trumps this no-take policy here, that the economic, again, taking cost into consideration, that the economic gains of oil and gas exploration exceed the risk of what it poses to endangered species. All right. So federal agency restrictions, this is the Indiana bat that we also see here in the state of Michigan. This is one of those species that is at risk predominantly because of disease, and so they are protected. Technically speaking, again, the federal government cannot do anything to jeopardize the continued existence of any endangered species. However, we do see significant exceptions to this, again, because of things like cost-benefit analysis and trying to weigh the costs of species protection. So, how the government can get around this is this organization called the God Squad, and they're named that, it's not their official name, they are named that because essentially they get to play God, right? They get to decide what species get to exist and what species don't when when government action is in conflict with the law. So, they can exempt federal projects from restrictions of development. This is a cabinet-level endangered species committee that will convene and make these decisions about what species get to live and what species don't. They, again, conduct a cost-benefit analysis. So finances are central to all of this. And unfortunately, very often this means that the species don't win out. And actual convening of this committee is rare. They usually don't actually get together. They've only gotten together a handful of times to deal with this particular issue. All right, so with this policy, one of the challenges that we see, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, is this problem with private property owners. Because most species exist on private property, what is this balance between what the government can and cannot tell you what to do with your land? And so what was added to the Endangered Species Act in one of its amendment provisions were these things called habitat conservation plans. And so the idea here was to sort of incentivize landowners to protect some of their property through these HCPs while allowing development. So if you are concerned or know that you have endangered species on your property, you have the option to put together one of these habitat conservation plans where you assess the impact on a particular species from whatever kind of action it is that you are proposing. Oftentimes this is development. You outline the steps that you will take to avoid, minimize, or mitigate the impacts on that particular species. And how you're going to pay for it, right? How are you going to pay for habitat restoration or whatever it is that you're doing? And this requires some sort of habitat protection to be in conjunction with your development. And in exchange for doing all of this stuff and creating these habitat conservation plans and getting it approved, it's a long, arduous process, right? This isn't an easy thing to do, but you get that handed, essentially you get out the jail-free card by the government, you get your incidental take permit, which says that you are allowed to take so many endangered species. This could be one or it could be several. So if you have more than one species on your property, you can add as many in as you want to your list. Or if you think that a species might be listed in the future, you can also add them as well. And so the government will give you your incidental take permit where you will not be in trouble if inadvertently in your development process you harm or kill a particular species. This picture here of these flowers, these are, get the name right, dwarf lake iris. They are found in northern Michigan. And all of the plant species here in Michigan are listed as threatened on the endangered species list as opposed to endangered. So, and again, that's probably part of the problem with these non-charismatic species, right? Feeling these fuzzy friendlies with flowers might be hard for some of us. This flower here is the Eastern Prairie Fringed Orchid, which is found in southwest Michigan as well as other areas of Michigan and is also a threatened species. Another thing that private landowners can do here is offer safe harbor agreements. So this is a regulatory assurance for non-federal landowners who voluntarily aid in species recovery. The focus here again is on habitat improvements, even if the improvements result in incidentally taking a species. So again, if the improvements that you need to make might put something in danger, we're still going to allow that to move forward. Candidate conservation agreements are similar to safe harbor, but for species that are facing threat of becoming endangered. So this is extended to both those at most risk as well as those that are not as endangered. All right, so criticisms and challenges. Here we have a sea lion, California sea lion, another one of those that receives significant amount of funding on the list, one of those top 10 species. So again, this species approach as opposed to an ecosystem approach. So one of the major criticisms is that we need to be more biologically rational when thinking about protecting species. Again, if we're only focusing on one thing in isolation, it's going to be hard to create a plan that's really going to help that species to recover. Too much money spent and attention on this charismatic megafauna. So 50% of the funding goes to the top 10 species, which I have listed here. Some of these are, if you look at the list, you'll see some repeats on them. So I just lumped them together. So it's actually maybe like the top 15 to 20 listed here. But steelhead salmon, so there's various populations across the nation that are protected. Chinook salmon, again, multiple populations protected. Sturgeon, bull trout, sockeye salmon, the red truncated woodpecker, sea lions, coho salmon, desert tortoise, and the northern spotted owl. So most of those have either commercial purposes, or can be considered to be, right, these charismatic species. We don't see any plants there, we don't see anything venomous there, we don't see any insects there, and all of those things are very important to the health of the ecosystem. So again, if we're not focusing our attention on that, it's going to be challenging to protect these species. The Indiana bat and the northern long-eared bat are in the top 25. But in general, that's an anomaly, right? So these non-charismatic species tend to not fare well. The non-environmental criticism of the policy, not enough, or too much focus on subspecies. So those that would not be in favor of the Endangered Species Act, right, would say that who cares about a subspecies? We have something similar somewhere else. If they go, it's okay, right? Obviously, the criticism to that is no, this biodiversity is actually really, really important, and well, that it would be really critical for that particular location to lose one of those species. Another non-environmental criticism is we should actually be paying more attention to economics, right? That at the end of the day, that's what this is all about, and if the species goes extinct, does that really matter in the long term in terms of the economic gains that we could make? The third criticism is environmental train wrecks, and so the classic example is the example of the northern spotted owl. So in this particular instance, what we were looking at was protecting a species versus widespread logging in Northern California. And the logging was going to put the northern spotted owl at risk because of mating patterns that were required in terms of the amount of acreage that these species need to mate, as well as migratory corridors that were going to be disrupted by the cutting of trees. And so there was a lot of debate and discussion about whether or not it was worth saving this subspecies of the northern spotted owl versus the closing of a sawmill and the jobs that would be lost because of that. And so there was a lot of dialogue that environmentalists were being unreasonable in their requests to save this subspecies, and that jobs in the economy were much more important. And then the last criticism here, again, is this challenge of property rights. And so I'm going to get into this in a few minutes again when I talk about these non-charismatic species. But generally, when we think about Americans, and it goes all the way back to the founding of our country and the influence of philosophers like John Locke, we hold our property very dear, and we find it to be very important and fundamental to who we are, right? And this government intrusion on what is ours, this focus on private property and individualism are fundamental to being American. And so this potential infringement of property rights presents significant challenges to the law. And although they've created these exceptions with habitat conservation plans and safe harbor plans and those sorts of things, it still doesn't answer the question of what do we do about this challenge of private property, and how do we deal with landowners, how do we encourage them or incentivize them moving forward to address endangered species on their property. Overall, the Endangered Species Act, it's not perfect. Environmentalists will say it's not perfect. Those against the policy will say that it's not perfect. But the problem with politics is that when you open something up for dialogue and discussion on the floor to potentially change an act, ideally maybe to make it more amenable to species protection, you also make it open to completely get rid of it. And so we see that especially today with a lot of the environmental policies that we have on the books. There's a lot of reluctance to readdress them, to actually make them, ideally to make them stronger, because there's this huge risk that they could just be repealed. And I'm thinking again about this, about your talk earlier this morning, and in my class with my students, we talk about, actually just talked about it on our midterm, this saying of organization is the mobilization of bias. And so how we organize ideas around particular issues, and that they might not be founded on science, they might not be founded on truth, but if you have the loudest voice and you make the best argument to convince people that what you're doing is correct, and it seems like you've got the power behind you, when you actually don't, you can win that policy argument. And that is very, very challenging, not just to dealing with endangered species, but to dealing with environmental issues across the board. And with that comes this argument also of science. And again, science is critically important to saving endangered species. But when we think about Americans and we think about our knowledge, our broad knowledge of science and understanding science, especially when we think about these big, large scale, I'm thinking climate change, which isn't the subject of my talk, but certainly deals with endangered species. We have a hard time understanding the complexity of that science, and so we tend to just turn our mind off, right? We stop thinking about it. And that's wrong, right? We really need to ask those questions and try to understand the dialogue about this, because one of the things that's been going on with politics is that is trying to win this science argument about what is and is not true about climate change, or what is and is not true about protecting individual species or subspecies. And so that presents, if you aren't asking questions and you're being persuaded by this organization, this bias, you know, it's going to be status quo, right? And status quo in politics has a lot of power and a lot of sway. And it's really, really challenging to change that. And sometimes what we'll see with these issues, any environmental issue, is that I just lost my train of thought. No idea what I was going to say. I'm going to move on. It'll come back to me. So sorry about that. Agency criticism. So the agency argues that the law is too vague, that this needs to we do need to address how how we can improve the Endangered Species Act. Challenges of funding, which is a challenge for all environmental issues. They just don't have enough money to do what they need to do, and the priority just isn't there. And so when you think about endangered species or any other environmental issue, and you ask Americans, what do you think about protecting species? Or what do you think about climate change? Or what do you think about clean air, clean drinking water? Most say, yeah, I don't want to get cancer from drinking my water. I think this is really, really important. Next step, would you pay $5 to do this a month? No, right? So we click the like button on social media. We say a lot of things about caring about this stuff, but when push comes to shove, we don't take action, and we don't call our legislators and say, I really think you should fund this. I think this is fundamental to creating a better environment and all of the extendable things that can come from that. It's just not, we just don't have that priority, which is a huge challenge, right? How do we make the environment, do we make endangered species a priority for Americans? And then, as I mentioned, these complicated questions of science. So we focus a lot on STEM in education today, but some of those things that you can talk about in the classroom are still heavily restricted in terms of understanding the science behind these particular issues. So, administrative changes. This is sort of where we are now with respect to the current administration. So there's been stricter emphasis on cost, so we don't want to spend a lot of money protecting endangered species. We have ended the practice of extending protections to species based on threatened or endangered status, and now for threatened, funding is all on a case-by-case basis, so those that are at potential risk for becoming endangered are less likely to receive federal funding. We have removed requirements that federal agencies consult with scientists and wildlife experts before approving permits for mineral extraction, because, you know, what do they know? They're just scientists. And we've also weakened the Migratory Bird Treaty, so people and businesses are no longer accountable for killing protected animals as they migrate. So those are serious challenges moving forward for endangered species. So thinking about the non-charismatic, I did a research project with a colleague of mine, and we asked a lot of questions. It was done in Indiana, where I was in graduate school at the time, and we asked a lot of questions about what sort of arguments are the most persuasive for individuals in terms of protecting endangered species. And what we actually found was this morality argument is huge. So that we have this moral obligation. This was across the board for both Democrats and Republicans, that we have a moral obligation to protect species. It wasn't the economic argument, it wasn't the recreational argument, it wasn't the aesthetic argument. Those were all good arguments. This one actually came out higher, which isn't normally how the National Fish and Marine Services or the National Wildlife Service, how they approach these particular issues. And this was especially the case when looking at private property owners. So how do you get private property owners on board? Some research tend to suggest that maybe this obligation to species protection is important. When we polled landowners, the survey we just talked to landowners about endangered species, most were farmers. It's sort of a rural county that we were looking at in Indiana. Most wanted to protect endangered species, but they also wanted to maintain their private property rights and without government interference. And so using some sort of, we don't know what, but some sort of incentive, whether it's a tax-based incentive or otherwise, to encourage landowners to protect these species so that they have some say in what they can do with their private property, but they are incentivized to move forward. The obligation, they also did, those that were surveyed felt that we had an obligation to future generations. So this idea of sustainability, that we have this obligation to protect these species moving forward. And what we found was that Democrats and Republicans, despite what politicians will tell you, that identified on our survey really weren't all that far apart in terms of what they wanted for endangered species. And I think a lot of times politics can really cloud our judgment. You see somebody and you judge them immediately. Oh, well, you're a Democrat, so you must think ABC, or oh, you're a Republican, so you must think XYZ. And there's no way that we're ever going to be able to come to a compromise, which just isn't true. But it's very hard to put those bias, those stereotypes that we have ingrained in us, that are socialized into us, to set those aside and have a genuine dialogue. And so we've seen this in other areas, both with endangered species as well as with land management issues and those sorts of things. When you can get the community engaged and you can have these genuine dialogues, and also it's important thinking about wildlife management, to have those genuine dialogues with agency members. That's not just lip service of, okay, but I'm still going to do what I want, where you actually grow these relationships. We've seen a lot of success in a variety of environmental areas, but those relationships are really hard to build and really hard to cultivate. They take a lot of time and a lot of investment. So again, it's making that environmental decision your priority moving forward, which just doesn't always rank high on our list of priorities politically, which again can present significant challenges. This is the snuff box mussel, which is also native to Michigan and is also listed as endangered. Other things that we found in our research was paying attention to fairness. How are we fair to both species as well as landowners, property rights, those sorts of things, that should be better embodied. Beliefs about property are critical to support the Endangered Species Act and extendable to these non-charismatic species. We know we can do it. It's just about putting together the right programs to push this forward. Landowners were more supportive of cooperative, incentivized plans, as I mentioned, and this would be ideally a mix of incentives and regulations. So you need to have, the agency needs to be the backstop. They need to be able to go in. But that it was a mixture here that we were looking at moving forward. As I mentioned, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has traditionally focused on these utilitarian and practical reasons to save endangered species, but the research suggests that there's actually more room for this moral argument, and perhaps with better results. So the question then becomes, how do we integrate that into the policy? How do we integrate that in discussing species protection with landowners, and how do we shift this focus moving forward? Again, this status quo of agencies, of policy, of politics is very hard to change. And so when you're approaching the agency and saying, you know, maybe you should talk about this in a different way, there's probably going to be some resistance and kickback to that. So how do we work on engaging to change the dialogue in terms of protecting these particular species? especially with respect to the uncharismatic. I would argue the wolf is charismatic, but because of the predation issue, some people really have very strong negative feelings against wolves. The picture of the butterfly is the Mitchell Stair butterfly, which is native to Michigan and Indiana, and I did not know this when I was finding my pictures, but it is one of the most endangered butterfly species ever, so that's interesting, and it's only found in rare wetlands, and specifically found in fens, and wetlands, hopefully you know, are like very endangered habitats. We've drained over 80% across the United States, and these are the kidneys of the ecosystem and are critical to ecosystem health. So without protecting those wetlands, we won't have these beautiful butterflies. And then this last one is not native to Michigan, but I thought was interesting. It's the Ozark hellbender salamander. It's the largest salamander species in America. So. That is all I have to say, and I think there's a couple of minutes left if anybody has any questions for me moving forward.
I do. On one of your slides, you talked about protection for the species and what landowners can do. The one thing I saw missing, though, is communicating to them the value of that particular species.
Sure.
And I found that, yeah, when you talk to somebody, I didn't realize the iris was protected. I've got them all over our wetland. But, you know, just showing that how everything is connected. And how, yeah, that to you that looks like pond scum, but that's providing food to this, to that. And you like turtles, so therefore you should like that scum, you know, that kind of thing. And we need to do more of that.
Yeah, that biology, that whole ecosystem approach is really, really, really fundamental, and something that I would agree that I think we need to do more of. I teach a class in sustainability, and so that's what that's all about, right? If you understand the links between all of these things, and not just the environmental links, but even the economic links, right? So if you have this rare species on your property, in the right way, you can promote ecotourism or those sorts of things, and that can be really beneficial for you as well, but we tend to not think about it that way. The moment you say you have an endangered species on your property, usually the reaction is,
Oh, God, what can I do?
what's going to happen to my bank account, right? What is the government going to do to prevent me from moving forward, instead of thinking, oh, okay, I can work with this, right? Let's figure out, maybe my original plan's not going to work, but there's going to be an alternative. But a lot of people don't think like that, so it presents challenges.
Jumping off of what you said a little bit, you talked about, right, the need to address issues on like a holistic ecosystemic level, right? But you also talked about Lockean liberalism and super hyper individualism that comes along with that. So my question is kind of more theoretical, but like, do you believe that hyper individualism is kind of like an ideological barrier to addressing issues on a more systemic level? And then if so, like, how do you combat that?
The $1 million question. I do think that it is a challenge. I think that that's in many ways where politics gets in the way. A lot of times we see a lot of agreement on these particular issues, but then what I was going to say before, on a lot of these issues, government scientists agree we need to do these things. These things are real. These things are a problem. And again, it's not exactly related to this, but like climate change. Government scientists have agreed that climate change is a problem and a threat to America since the late 1970s, but politics has prevented us from doing anything about that. And so I think that these I think we get caught up in the realm of politics, and because of that, we can't think about some of these more practical, rational arguments, because politics is not rational. And I think that, my opinion, right? I think that this presents significant challenges to this overall question of sustainability in America. I think that that's one of the huge barriers that we face. How do we fix that? I don't have an answer. I think there's a lot of, I think education matters. I think dialogue, I think being able to sit, we live in this time right now where we don't really want to hear what anybody else has to say. The environment's very toxic, and I think that's extremely problematic for both sides of the aisle. in terms of coming up with constructive plans moving forward that regardless of what party affiliation you have, they're fundamental for us as humans and for us as a nation to really create a society that we all want to live in. And so I think it is a huge barrier, and yeah, I'm not exactly sure how to change it.
I was gonna say, I think, and to answer that a little bit, sometimes I think it takes finding the common ground. I have found that, like with the wolf issue, where I'll go to a farmer and say, my goal is to not kill wolves, your goal is not to have depredation. I don't want to see depredation because the wolves will be killed. So let's see how we can work that out. You know, if you're going to get fencing and your problem is you don't have the manpower, I can get the volunteers to do the manpower. And you try to find...
And that's,
right.
Yeah, creating those communities around the same issue where you can genuinely have that dialogue and that relationship with each other is really, really important. But it's hard work. It doesn't just...
One-on-one, a lot, very time-consuming.
Yes.
Just see the thought here. I think one of our battlegrounds is not in the science, and a retired school teacher, the classroom is not all that effective either. But they say that the Sherlock Holmes stories changed the role of evidence in criminology, and Charles Dickens changed the poorhouse laws of England. And I've seen people watch these remodeling shows or cooking shows as if it's something really exciting. I think that's where we need a TV show and a literature that makes the environment cool. And I'll tell you, when my school I didn't teach it, but we had an excellent environmental science program, and it was wiped out almost instantly by forensic science because it had a TV show to go with it.
Yeah, pop culture can be really key in getting people interested. I had a student several years ago, we were talking about killer bees, and he watched something on the Discovery Channel about them. And he was like, wow, if all environmental shows were like that, then I'd really care about it because I was terrified. Some of the problem with environmental issues is they're hard to see in front of you, they're hard to see right here and now. So especially a lot of the problems that we're facing are long-term consequences. And so how do you make that relatable to somebody that just doesn't see that on an everyday basis? And so yeah, maybe some sort of pop culture DIY show or something dealing with environmental issues. I don't know. I mean, that could certainly help. Yeah.
I'm not creating one for it. It's somebody else.
So, full disclosure, I worked for 4 years for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the Wildlife and Sports Fish Restoration Program. And one of the main grants I worked on was the State Wildlife Grant Program. So I sort of a two-part question. One is we really framed that program as proactive. So a way of preventing endangered species from, or preventing species from becoming endangered. So my first question is, what are your thoughts on proactiveness?
I think it's yes.
Okay. And then my other thought was, a big piece of this program was state match funds. So we had state wildlife action plans that each of the states put together in exchange for like a piece of these federal dollars. So having worked with the ESA, I think this is a really good overview. But there's also this like whole other like state level too.
Correct.
And one thing we really liked was partnerships. So if there's a species that's in your state wildlife action plan, you can reach out to your agency, and seeing partnerships really gets extra bonuses for grant money.
Yeah, I mean, I think being proactive and again, having it, you have pockets of varying, not just Fish and Wildlife, but varying agencies like the U.S. Forest Service would be like this too, that are more proactive or progressive, but it's not necessarily institutionally wide. And so how do you create that? How do you try to change that within the culture of the agency to promote things like that? Another area of research I've done has been on forest management plans, and so looking at those areas that have done collaborative management plans where they've worked with stakeholders in the community to come up with a plan that everybody's going to be happy with. And you can do something like that with endangered species as well. And those that have done it and done it well have not been litigated, which is like unheard of with forest management plans because they work with those stakeholders. And so I think that there's a lot of potential with that for endangered species if you did it on this broader, like ecosystem-based plan.